Well, thank you for having us here today. Very privileged to be in the big room. But today we're talking about some of our results from the Aspires project. And can I just have a show of hands of anyone who's familiar with this project? Okay, thank you. That was helpful. So the project team is made up of myself, Professor Louise Archer, a previous research associate, Becky Francis, who does a lot of the gender work on the project, and we have an associated PhD studentship and an administrator. So a big team for a research project in this area. It's a 10-year longitudinal study, and it's funded by the ESRC. So although today I'm going to be talking obviously about work experience and careers education, just to give you kind of overarching feel for what our main aims for the project are. So we look a lot at trying to understand these changing influences on students' specific aspirations for science careers, but also more broadly students outside the sciences and their interests there. We look at influences of parents and peers, and then at this phase of the project, we're also looking at careers education and work experience. The next phase will be able to actually relate a lot of what we're finding and what I'll be talking today about actual attainment. So we're pretty excited to get that data from the National Pupil Database, and that's going to be coming this fall. But for today, the focus will be on giving you a bit of an overview of some of the findings that have come from a recent report that we submitted for evidence to one of the inquiries at the House of Commons. It's actually culminated in some very exciting recommendations, one of which might relate to a little bit of the previous presenter, but that careers education might be, or is suggested to be added to an inspection list for schools. So that's something that's new and hot off the press. But I'll be talking today about these findings. I am aware that work experience is a focus, so I'll be doing that as well. But the main bulk will be careers education. So on the Aspires project, we do have this science focus that I mentioned, but why are we interested in looking at careers for Year 11 students? And we started off by appreciating the vast amount of literature, as we'll be familiar with, that's out there, the range of positive outcomes that can come from good quality, impartial careers advice and guidance and work experience practices, positive motivations, recent studies showing that career talks can lead to future earnings for students that are, or pupils that are 26 years old. I think it was an extra £2,000 they can make if they've participated in 6 very helpful careers talks. So the importance of these types of activities in schools, but then also looking to the debates that we're still seeing about the quality of the provision being patchy, people being concerned around that in policy as well as educators. And with schools also struggling to implement new requirements without additional funding. So just trying to understand that situation a bit. We also were excited about about Adrian's findings there, talking to actual pupils and getting their experiences to be able to triangulate a lot of the work that's out there. Because from our understanding, there was a lot from school leadership, a lot from the career professionals themselves in terms of what provision is being provided or offered to students, but not a lot about the students' experiences. So building on some of the studies that are already there in the literature. So we're aiming to address 3 questions. The first being, what are students in Year 11, what types or sorts of advice, careers advice and guidance are they reporting, and also for work experience? And also, who is actually getting this advice? So what groups of students is it that are actually being offered this or taking up the opportunities? And then lastly, do students feel satisfied with it? Has it been helpful? Is there anything that they think could have been improved? So the structure of our data, this is a 10-year longitudinal study. We have a mix of large-scale surveys as well as in-depth interviews. So the surveys are cohort data, so that is a chunk of students that we measure at the age of 10 and that it increments throughout that up until the age of 19. Whereas the interviews, they are the same students that we're speaking with on each of these data collection points. So there are about 92 at the age of 10, and we've managed to retain 70 of those students up to Year 11. And those are very in-depth interviews with the students as well as their parents. So we have views on careers education from both perspectives, parents and students, as well as work experience. On our survey instrument, as on the Aspires project with a science focus, we have a lot of specific items relating to science self-concept, students' perceptions of their science lessons, their attitudes towards school generally, their aspirations for life, and also participation in activities outside of school. But for today, we'll be talking obviously about the careers, education, and work experience part of our data. So what data do we actually have? And I thought it was important just to give you a very specific and clear idea of what questions were asked by these students. So they were asked, have you been provided with careers information, advice, and have you been provided with any information from school or the career services relating to the jobs that you're interested in? And then they were also asked if they thought this was useful. On our interviews, we also asked the students the same similar set of questions, but a bit more in depth. Why, if they weren't happy with it, why or why not? And we also asked them specifics about what the provision was. So it's not just they've had advice, but what are the qualities of that advice? We also wanted to know that if they hadn't had the advice, did they know the plan? Did they know when they might be getting it? And also, had they had any previous advice? And then again, how could it be improved? So for the next probably 7 minutes, there's going to be a lot of graphs. I wanted to treat this as a kind of data sharing exercise. So you will have a copy of this. You will absolutely not be able to see a lot of what's on the graphs. But the main highlighted heading on each slide is kind of my main point. So any questions we can definitely talk about after, but please don't panic. But before we get onto the graphs, we just wanted to be clear what we actually are conceptualizing as careers advice, or what's being measured here. And we're using Hutchinson's conceptualization. We're appreciating that it's a big picture, there are lots of different elements, and what our data captures is only one part of that. So it's this element of careers, information, advice, and guidance, as well as a small element of the work-related learning with the work experience questions I will be talking about. But just important to give us an overview there. So what we found before getting onto the survey data was that in interviews, students were able to tell us about what types of advice they were being provided with, and the majority of this advice was one-to-one sessions with an advisor. That advisor was either internal or external to the school, someone that they were either very familiar with, a part of the teaching staff, or just an external provider that they didn't know. Students also mentioned that a lot of these sessions involved being given a questionnaire and completing that questionnaire and leaving the session, and that was the extent of it, or being given a website that they needed to go to and do some investigations themselves. We did also have some students, 11% of our interview sample report that they had scheduled curriculum classes relating to careers advice. Often these students were saying that it was a lot about more general citizenship and those types of development qualities than the actual provision of information for certain careers. So what this does is give us a little bit of an impression of what students might have understood from our survey question when we asked them about careers information. So we're making an assumption here that they're referring to one-to-one sessions mainly and career talks. So what we find on our survey is that 2/3 of students are reporting careers information at school at year 11, and this is in England. We also can look at students' responses for how helpful they thought the advice had been and relate that to whether or not they'd had provision. And what we find is the students who have had careers information at school are significantly more likely to report that they're satisfied with it. We also find, relating to work experience, that less than half of our sample, and this is a sample of over 13,000 students in England, are reporting that they've had work experience at year 11. And most importantly, what our findings and what the series of graphs are going to show us is that this participation it's patterned in ways that might be extremely unhelpful, and we might want to take some time to think about reasons why this might be the case. So to begin with, what our survey results are showing us is that males are reporting more advice than female students at year 11. This is careers, information, advice, and guidance. That when we look at patterns by ethnicity, white students seem to be reporting more advice than their minority ethnic peers. Students also from socially advantaged backgrounds. So on our survey, the way we can measure this is looking at, it's a measure of cultural capital. And what we find is that students who have very high cultural capital are significantly more likely to report this advice than their peers with very low cultural capital. And I think the interesting thing on this graph is that if we look at very high, medium cultural capital, they're all quite similar, those bars. But the main difference seems to be the very low students. So those students coming from very disadvantaged backgrounds are not reporting as much advice. And we can talk, if anyone wants to talk about that a bit later, but we do think that there's lots of factors coming into play here. Students attending different schools that are differently resourced based on their backgrounds, but also in the literature what we know about teachers' perceptions of ability based on social background. We also look at, kind of as a proxy of attainment, but also what we know about the science education in England, triple science versus double science, and the prestige that often comes with students being streamed into certain routes. But what our data shows us is that triple science students are reporting more careers than their peers who are going into, who are in other science routes like BTech, for example. And then looking at attainment as a proxy, students in the top set for science and also students who attend schools that don't have any settings are reporting more careers advice. We also can look at students' plans, so what they want to do after the age of 16 and what kind of as a background factor for career provision. And what we find is that students who are planning to go on to A-levels, so this is intended plans, not definite, but students who are intending to do A-levels are reporting more advice, as well as their peers who are planning to go into apprenticeships. And that we think is particularly worrying if we look at about 50% of the students who are going into full-time work, so they will immediately be going to working environments, or who are really unsure about what they want to do and actually need the support, are reporting the least amount of careers information here. So possibly of more interest to us in this room today, but our data for work experience, this is what we have on the survey as well as the interview. So we're asking them, have you participated in work experience relating to the jobs that you're interested in? And again, in the interviews, was it helpful, but also who organized it, and a bit more of the quality there. So quickly what we find is, again, similar patterns. So males are reporting participating in work experience more than females. Students from white backgrounds are reporting more work experience. And then relating to the different science option streamings, instead of triple science now, it seems that double science students and students who are going in the more applied routes are actually having more work experience than students on the triple science route who are potentially just going into the A-level options there. And when we look at their post-16 plans, apprenticeships are getting more work experience, which might be an obvious finding there, but also students who are going into part-time work are getting more, with students who are planning to go into A-levels reporting the least amount, as well as students who are, again, unsure of what they actually want to do. So for our work experience data, we also wanted to look at differences based on region. And what the survey data shows us is that there are regional differences. Students from the Southwest were reporting the most work experience, whereas students from the Northeast were reporting the least. And that's a difference, quite a big percentage difference there. That's 52% in the Southwest versus 32% in the Northeast reporting this work experience. So interesting to have a think around why that might be the case, where it could be intersections of school backgrounds as well as students' backgrounds, but would be interested to hear any thoughts on that one. We can also look at our data by students' aspirations. So based on what do they intend to do after school, after year 11, and break that down a little bit. And what our survey data shows us is that students going into engineering, going into science, wanting to be a doctor, wanting to be a teacher, are getting the most careers information, versus their peers who are going into the arts careers, who are maybe wanting to go into hair and beauty, design work, those types of things. And I think this is interesting in terms of causality. Which one comes first? Is it that the students who are going into science or engineering generally are higher aspiring, so they are more motivated to go and get support? Or is it that they've had careers education, they've had someone sit down and talk to them about those careers, and that's why they're more likely to report an aspiration there? We also can repeat this for work experience and kind of see an opposite result here. So at the very bottom of this, the students who are reporting the least amount of work experience are students in science and students who are intending to go into law careers. Whereas students who are intending to go into a trade or to become a teacher are reporting quite a lot of work experience. And this could have some interesting implications about the timing. We're aware this is year 11 only, but it could be that law firms, as we might be aware, maybe they don't want to take students until they've done their A-levels or are a bit more mature, but just an interesting discussion there about why these patterns might be happening. So after our survey analysis kind of paints a bit of a picture of this patterned nature, and we were interested to look to our interview data to help us try to figure out or explain why some of these patterns are actually happening. So one of the things that came up with students was this idea of too little, too late. They felt that they wanted the advice to come sooner, that they wanted it to be more involved and to have a bit more frequency. So we had only 4 students in our interviews mention that they'd met with a careers advisor more than once. And a lot of these students also mentioned that the provision was, 20% of our interview participants reported that it was obligatory. So that's not a lot of students saying that everyone in the school needs to get careers advice, only 20%. We also had several students report that it was too late in terms of they've already made their subject choices. It was toward the end of the year. They were having exam pressures. They were thinking of applications. It was just not the best time. If they'd had it before October term, it might have been a bit more something they would be more involved with. And this is one of the major things that came out of our interview analyses, was looking at the actual structure of the provision. So we found, again, that a lot of students were reporting it was a self-referral nature. So you had to self-refer. And this is a quote from one of our students basically saying how difficult it is to navigate this environment. You know, we're not sure where this career advisor is. We've never met her. I can't go in this hallway. The door's locked here. I have these classes. How am I supposed to make this work? And this is a particularly motivated student as well. Students also, female students were more likely to talk about these issues, about the actual nature of provision. So girls were coming up with those topics more than boys. And also looking at students from black backgrounds, they were more likely to be saying things to us like, if you need to have the confidence in order to do that. So it's putting a lot on students to actually recognize, firstly, they need the support, what type of support they need, and then to actually go and get that support. And we argue that it could be contributing to the gendered patterns as well as the ethnicity patterns that we're seeing with those groups of students maybe not having the amount of confidence necessary to do that. Students also reporting that it was biased and not impartial. They were concerned that it was a lot about A-level subject choices only. It wasn't about a career exploration exercise or what other options might be available. Particularly students who wanted to go other routes like apprenticeships were often a bit frustrated that it seemed to just be pushing you into A-levels, even though they maybe wanted to go into an apprenticeship. We also think that the lack of personalization can be an issue here. So students talked a lot about career talks. It's really difficult to engage all of us. We know it's a hard task. It has to be specific, but it's really not working the way that they're presented to us. They also talked about the kind of logistic problems when we've got large assembly rooms of students and it's a bit noisy. But also relating to the one-to-one sessions, they really found that they wanted more beyond just this website, that it wasn't just about creating a questionnaire that gives you, spits out a career that you should be doing. And this particular student at the bottom also wanted a second follow-up session and hoped that she was going to get something in the future, and that never happened when we followed up. So again, we think that these could be contributing to some of the patterns that we're seeing, specifically for girls as well. We had a lot of girls report these certain issues. And lastly, even beyond a lot of the issues that I've talked about, we are suggesting that it could be that certain groups of students are preferring other resources. So the female students in our sample and students from South Asian communities were more likely to talk about feeling more comfortable talking with their parents at home about this. This particular student saying, I could ask my dad, and then he could ask someone else, and that I could do a lot of self-research, so that could be contributing. And we think this is particularly worrying if we think about students' social backgrounds, who might not have a dad who is an anaesthetist who can give her a connection to another medical degree. And that's something that came out of our work experience as well, that a lot of the work experiences were organized by the parents. So it wasn't the school organizing. It was either not available anymore, or your parent could organize it and help you get one. So that has some particularly worrying implications. So just to conclude, we have, looking at our survey data and interview data, we're arguing that careers education might be failing to reach all students despite the statutory requirement, and that it's possibly in ways that are patterned to be unhelpful and are worrying, specifically for students who are unsure of what they want to do after the age of 16 for girls, minority ethnic students, and from lower social backgrounds. And that urgent attention needs to be paid to actually looking at these patterns and redressing the inequalities that we're seeing. And I would like to leave you with some of our suggestions in terms of what might be done. We would suggest that beyond just looking at what good quality careers education, good quality work experiences are for students, but actually looking at participation. So who is getting those? Who are getting the actual offers that we're providing to students? And also for schools and organizations to be monitoring, to be evaluating, and to actually try to look at some strategies about this participation that they're seeing. We also think the finding with the regional differences we're seeing with work experience need to be considered, particularly why students who are aspiring for science and law are maybe not getting as much. And then lastly, this issue about the structure of the system. So the self-referral, selective nature of the provision, we think that particular care needs to be taken when that's coming into play. And also that has implications for employer initiatives or any related initiatives that are often provided to targeted groups of students, or even to students or schools that are opting in for that support. So we think that's an area that needs some care and attention. So I'll leave you with any contact details and some new project videos. Thank you.